Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler, in association with Square. Square can help with your business needs from menu management and payments to online ordering. Visit square.com for more. Now, remember Blackberry? They once defined smartphones and was probably the first real smartphone that many of us had in our lives. Then they disappeared almost overnight. Not surprisingly, there have been some books and movies on the topic, and one of the best ones, Losing the Signal, the untold story behind the extraordinary rise and spectacular fall of BlackBerry, has just been made into a movie, which is in cinemas right now, called Blackberry. And I'm delighted to say that the co-author of the book, who's a technology reporter with the Globe and Mail in Canada, Sean Silcoff, joins me today. Sean, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Adrian.
Well, let's start at the beginning. BlackBerry was just a small company that started above a bagel shop.
It did. It's hard to think that, and not just any old bagel shop, but a bagel shop in sort of a forgotten corner of southern Ontario. This is not a tech capital by any means. This was a sort of a dated industrial space. Right now, of course, Waterloo is one of the technological hearts of Canada, and a lot of that is due to BlackBerry. And it starts with these a group of people around Mike Lazaridis, who's this young genius. And he had been told by a high school teacher that the person, never mind computers, the person who combines computers and wireless technology is going to create something special. And so they were trying to do that in Waterloo in the late '80s, mid '80s, late '80s, early '90s, and they were sort of having somewhat success. And then Jim Balsillie came along.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think for most people, our consciousness of BlackBerry was really in the 2000s, early 2000s onwards. But in 1999, the late 90s, I think, they really launched with pagers, didn't they?
Well, yeah, they it's funny. They developed a way to communicate wirelessly with with email, and this was at a time where all the telco companies are all into two-way paging, and because of the limitations of other people's technology, you were sort of limited to these canned paging messages that you could send back and forth. And their message was to the telcos, well, we you can actually deliver email, like full email. And the carriers weren't actually that interested. Everyone was focused on paging, but they could see the explosion of email. They had been email users for a long time. Emails actually had been around since the '70s, and this was the moment. This was the moment that Hotmail was coming on the scene, that the internet was exploding, and they could see that people would want the full capacity to communicate via full email. So that's what they sold. And when the carriers that they partnered with only wanted paging, they said, "Well, how about you rent us a little bit of your unused space on your data network, and we'll just do this email thing on our own." And the carrier said, "Sure, give us $5 million, and that'll be it." They didn't. The carriers didn't realize that they were sort of handing the keys to BlackBerry, because this thing really took off. And meanwhile, two-way paging sort of died very quickly thereafter.
I suppose at its height, BlackBerry, I think it had 80 to 90 million subscribers. Um, what were those years like to be a BlackBerry owner, to work for the company around that ecosystem?
Well, BlackBerry really was sort of the technological status symbol of the early to mid 2000s. I remember I was a young journalist in the late '90s, early 2000s, and my friends who'd gone to work in the corporate world had their Palm Pilots, and they would proudly show you their Palm Pilot. It was this expensive piece of technology they had access to. And then a year or two later, they weren't talking about Palm Pilots; they were talking about Blackberries. And these devices really freed people for the first time from their desks to be able to communicate in a way that we take for granted today. But in the year 2000, 2001, it's kind of a big deal to be able to send a message from from a football match, or from a taxi, or when you're in line in the airport. It's seen as a way to get work done, to deal with the barrage of things you need to do in the work world. It's the thing that busy, important people use, because their time is valuable. And that's kind of the
Mm.
it's kind of the message. It's kind of the I guess that's a bit of the aura around BlackBerry. And they really very successfully geared this toward the corporate world. In fact, that's how they came into Europe. All of their clients in America, like General Electric and large Fortune 500 companies, were asking, can our European colleagues, our European employees have this too? It was a productivity tool. It was a messaging tool, and that's really where that was really their wedge for international growth.
And of course, in here in Europe, Nokia was the king. I mean, it was pretty big in North America as well, but Nokia absolutely ruled the roost. And for a while there, it looked like there was almost a duopoly that was pretty much impregnable in the Western world. BlackBerry for email, Nokia for pretty much everything else. Was there any sense of pride as a Canadian in the company at that time? We'll come on to its downfall later, but at that moment, because I talked to Finns about Nokia, for example, and they're still proud of what Nokia did.
Right, and actually, Nokia was part of what BlackBerry referred to as the men's club. Motorola, Ericsson, Nokia, and I think Samsung. They really ruled the game. Oh, absolutely, Canadian pride. I mean, historically in Canada, we have like one tech company at a time that's a big deal. It was Nortel in the 1990s when the internet was getting built out. It was Research in Motion, which is the earlier name of BlackBerry in the 2000s, and now it's Shopify. There are many other tech companies, but there's always one dominant name, and for sure they were very very proud Canadians. In fact, Jim Balsillie, when Canada won. Hockey at the Olympics one year. There's this iconic image here of our the team captain skating around with a Canada flag. Jim Balsley actually threw the flag over the glass to him, and they were very proud of being from Waterloo. If people would call from Silicon Valley or New York and say, "Well, we'd like to meet with you," Jim would say, "That's fine. When are you going to be in Waterloo next?"
Mm.
The idea was, they weren't going to go down to San Francisco or New York. The other people had to fly from wherever they were to Toronto and then take that drive out to Waterloo in order to meet with the people at BlackBerry. So they wanted the world to know that this was a Canadian company. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're in the best of times right there.
Yeah.
What happened?
A lot of things. Of course, this is where I get to plug my book and say it's all there. But there were a number of things that happened. You see, the BlackBerry was the device itself was problematic when Steve Jobs and the iPhone came along because really the BlackBerry was a very efficient machine that was a little more than a digitized version of a radio with two-way communications. So it was built to handle messaging. It was not purpose built for internet communications like the full internet. There were some problems with going to the full internet on a device. It would drain out batteries. It would clog up the networks, and the BlackBerry people were worried that it wasn't very secure. Also, it had a keyboard, and the iPhone didn't. And the amazing thing is, all those things were indeed problematic about the iPhone. AT&T, which was the first carrier to have it in America, ran into major network problems because of all the traffic. The first iPhone batteries lasted about 4 hours before you needed to plug them in, whereas the first BlackBerry lasted 4 weeks, believe it or not, on a single AA battery. So they had a device that was perfectly built. BlackBerry had a device that was perfectly built to send messages, and then of course BBM came along, which was super popular, was the forerunner of WhatsApp. And again, all you needed to do was type for those things. Whereas Steve Jobs wanted to bring the full internet into people's hands. The BlackBerry people saw the problems with that. But, when you change as a tech company, when you change a paradigm, you are definitely swimming upstream. BlackBerry had done that 10 years earlier with the BlackBerry, and then Apple did that with the iPhone. And once people had the full internet in their hands, Steve Jobs felt that they weren't going to want to go back, and he was right. And then Google came along with its Android, and the Android actually. People didn't realize this, and we sort of really get into this in our book. The Android probably had much more damaging impact on BlackBerry than Apple. Apple kind of came along and it grabbed a lot of the consumer market. BlackBerry was okay. Well, that's fine. We still have the business users, and also people love using BBM, and our phones are selling like hotcakes all around the world. What Android did was, instead of Google building their own phones, they handed that operating system out for free to handset makers around the world. Jim Balsley referred to it, the co-CEO, as 400, suddenly 400 handset makers having a business plan just handed to them.
Mm,
And the other thing that Google did that was very clever was, when they got an app store, they said to the telephone companies, you know what, the 30% of app sales that we get, the money, here, you can have it. Here's some free money.
mm,
So that instantly incentivizes all of the carriers to start pushing Android phones instead of BlackBerry phones. And a final key thing that happened technologically, and in the market, is that with a great downturn in 2008, 2009, companies were trying to cut costs. And so instead of assigning Blackberries from the mothership to all of their employees, they said, well, you can bring in any device you want and we'll just hook it into our network. And people at home weren't buying Blackberries, they were buying Apple and Android devices. So those things combined really created a major problem that BlackBerry was not prepared
mm,
for. They didn't have a whole computerized operating system underneath the BlackBerry. As I said, it was sort of a glorified radio that did one thing really, really well, which was messaging. And it took BlackBerry a full 6 years. A variety of reasons why it took so long. Again, we go into that in our book. 6 years for them to come up with a proper, true competitive response, a full computerized operating system called the BB10.
mm.
Technology, you do not have 6 years for a competitive response, and by then it was too late. The tide had turned, and they just couldn't get back in the game.
Now, there was a movie made based on your book, the book that you co-authored. Have you seen it?
I've seen it 6 times now.
6 times. Okay, you went with all the family. What did you think?
It's as a movie, it's extremely entertaining. As corporate history, it's about as faithful as most adaptations are for the movies, which is to say that they've created an entertaining product that I hope inspires people to read the book
Hmm.
to find out the true story. But it's certainly a very entertaining film, and I'm pleased for the filmmakers to see that the audiences and critics have really, really quite enjoyed it universally.
As someone who co-authored the book, what is it like seeing a film, a movie based on your book, and what are your feelings when you see what makes it into the movie as opposed to what you had to actually put into the book?
It's surreal. I saw it for the first time, just adding to the surreality of the situation, at Berlin. It premiered at the Berlinale, so I was in a room. I walked a red carpet with 2,000 people or so. I was sitting on a line with all the VIPs and people involved with the movie. And while I was watching the movie, the whole time, this was my first viewing of the movie. I was it was difficult to watch because I had a hard time mapping what I was seeing on screen to what I was to the story that I know well. Typical adaptations will do a number of things. They will create composite characters. They will play around with dates and times. They will incredibly simplify things to tell a story effectively for the visual medium, and they'll create dialogue and characters and move things around. And also, there's whole parts of the story that they won't tell. And
Mm,
this is what you need to do to make a movie. Uh, real life is complicated. Real life doesn't necessarily lend itself to the big screen in a way that will keep an audience in their seat for 2 hours. And so,
mm,
the first time I viewed it, I sort of walked out in a bit of a fog, trying to make sense of it. I knew it was a good movie. I knew it was a movie, and it's, especially if you just walked in and you didn't know the story, and you walked out 2 hours later, you'd say that that was a good film. But I really had to process it and think about it for a few days, and then see it a couple of more times, to be honest. But that's just me as the author, and I think
sure.
that's I think any author would feel that. I think Ron Chernow probably felt that the first time he saw Hamilton, which is
Mm,
probably one of the best Broadway plays of all time. I've read his book, I've seen the play, and it's like one is from Mars and one is from Venus. They're both brilliant works in their mediums. They both speak to larger truths and get to some interesting universal themes, but they are acclaimed works that live on their own in their own mediums. And I think ultimately that's where I came to with the BlackBerry movie, and I enjoy it as a film, although I, of course, it doesn't stick to the source material in a lot of ways, and it doesn't tell a large part of the story. But then that just enables me to say, well, that's great. If you find that story interesting, I think you would find the book interesting.
Go,
So let's do
absolutely.
that.
Go buy the book. Go buy the book. Um, Lastly, we think of the iPhone and Android now as being impregnable, particularly the iPhone. Do you think there's any chance that what happened to BlackBerry and maybe even to Nokia could happen to the iPhone or to Android?
I think that and it's so interesting because this year, with the arrival of ChatGPT and the impact that's having on the technology world, I think the movie and the book are actually very timely reminders that you can never ever take any kind of lead for granted in the technology world. As we say at the end of the book, winners and losers in the technology race change places all the time, and there's no finish line. So, maybe from the vantage point of October 2023, we can't necessarily see Apple losing its perch or Android, Google losing their perch, but never say never. I mean, look at the dominant technology companies or companies period from past decades. Some of them don't exist anymore. Some of them seemed like they could never lose their perch, and their names are lost to history. So,
Except
uh,
IBM. For some reason, IBM still exists. I still can't tell you what IBM does after 20 years as a tech journalist.
well, it still exists, but I mean, it's a shadow of its former self, and
Right.
it's a different company. IBM used to be the dominant name in tech. It was
Hmm.
much more dominant relative to the tech sector than Apple and Google combined. So
Hmm.
that should give everyone food for thought, I think.
Potentially apocryphal tale. The book, again, is called Losing the Signal, the untold story behind the extraordinary rise and spectacular fall of BlackBerry. And I've been talking to Sean Silcoff, who is the co-author of that book. Sean, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also to JJ Clark, who produced, Colin Doherty on video, and Gav Hennessy on sound. I'm Adrian Weckler, and you've been watching or listening to The Big Tech Show in association with Square. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.